So unlike B cells that can recognize, in some cases, in many cases, antigen directly by the surface receptor, T cells cannot do that. They have to have antigen presented to them by so-called antigen-presenting cells. So we're going to be using dendritic cell as an example here, but antigen-presenting cells are dendritic cells, macrophages, or B cells. So dendritic cell engulfs the antigen, breaks it down, and presents it on its surface via so-called major histocompatibility, so tissue compatibility, complex molecules. So those are MHC molecules. So MHC class 1 presented on all nucleated cells, and that's class 2. And here are the fragments of the antigen presented. So what's interesting about this is that MHC class 1 can be recognized only by the CD8 cells. And MHC class 2 can be recognized by CD4 cells. This is called MHC restriction. And the outcomes of it, sort of the consequences of that restriction, is that CD8 cells here, the effector cells that are derived from those, the cytotoxic lymphocytes, can then act on all nucleated cells, while CD4 cells will interact only with antigen presenting cells, because this molecule is present only on antigen presenting cells. So APCs only, all nucleated cells. Now let's compare the responses that CD4 and CD8 cells can induce. So here we're going to talk about CD4 cells. Remember that CD4 cells, CD4 T cells, they differentiate first and foremost into T helper cells. Now T helper cells, remember CD4 cells recognize MHC class 2, which is found on antigen presenting cells like B cells and macrophages. Well, T helper cells can increase B cell activation, which you can imagine leads to increased antibody production. And they also increase macrophage activation, which leads to, increased levels of phagocytosis. Of course, CD4 T cells, all T cells form memory cells. CD4 T cells can also become memory helper cells. And they also can become T regulatory cells. I'm not going to put them on the scheme, but they are going to be there. So T regulatory cells that are responsible for actually downplaying the immune response, controlling it and limiting it. Without T regulatory cells, you would have massive amount of autoimmune responses. Now CD8 cells differentiate into, of course, memory killers and just killer T cells, that's the old name, or cytotoxic lymphocytes. Cytotoxic lymphocytes, as any other derivative of CD8 cell, can recognize MHC class 1. so they can cause apoptosis of nucleated cells. Cells that are infected, cells that are cancerous, and so on and so forth. Now, how can specifically CD8 cell, but any cell, CD8 cell can recognize whether or not some cell, like fibroblast, should be destroyed? Well, it turns out that if that's a normal fibroblast, and on its surface on the MHC class 1 molecule, it shows its normal antigen, showing basically the sign, yeah, I'm fine. I'm self fibroblast. Okay, it waves the blue flag saying I'm not infected, I'm not cancerous, I'm good. But when fibroblast becomes infected, instead of waving its own flag, it waves the flag of the infectious agent. Okay, signaling I'm infected or I'm cancerous, please kill me. Now, one important feature, one important requirement for a proper CD8 cell activation is that CD8 cells, they also require T helpers. So essentially, if we go back to our CD4, CD8 story, and we put T helper here, and we put cytotoxic lymphocyte here, it turns out that T helper is required for the proper activation of the cytotoxic responses. To wrap it up in a small overview here, I want you to appreciate this. So we've got innate responses, right? And we've got adaptive responses. And adaptive are T cell responses and B cell responses. So B cell responses here, that produces antibodies. Antibodies opsonize the pathogen and increase the phagocytic activity. So that provides that link between the innate and adaptive response. Now, T cells, specifically T helper, they are necessary for the proper activation of B cells. So we can say that T helper cells provide the necessary link between the cellular and humoral branches of the adaptive response. Humoral refers to the solubility of antibodies. Cellular refers to the fact that the cells responding to the antigen. Not only these antibodies, not only can increase phagocytic activity, remember, they can also activate complement. So there's more than one link between the B cells and the innate response. And of course, T helper cells can also provide the link between the adaptive and the innate immunity, because remember, T helper cells are necessary for the stimulation of proper phagocytic activity.